Let me ask you a question. How hard is the English language? To you and to me, it's probably not that hard because we can already speak it. But to many others around the world, the English language is actually pretty difficult. So these people don't learn English, we don't learn their language, and eventually no one can communicate with anyone. This is a real problem around the world because there's just too many languages in the world. But over the past week, I learned about a new language that is designed to fix this problem. The language is called Pidgin. Someone hundreds of years ago realized that this language stuff is a problem, and so they decided to make up an entirely new language that is very similar to English, but much simpler. It has no hard grammar, no long words, and no crazy sentences. It's everybody's dream language. Instead of coffee, you say coffee. Library, book house. University, big school. Eat, kai kai. Dinner, night kai kai. Jungle,
big bush.
There is no I am, she is, you are, he is, none of that stuff. There is only
me, you, all.
Instead of 26 English letters, there is only
22.
These letters are out and complicated sentences are out. Please do not disturb in English is simplified to you know come inside to
you know can come inside.
No smoking allowed is simplified to you can't smoke to
no can smoke.
You look nice.
You look nice!
Exactly. You get the idea. This language is so good that it might actually save a life. Take Papua New Guinea for example. They have 800 tribes and 800 languages. It's almost impossible to communicate with all tribes if you don't learn 800 languages until the Pidgin language came. Now, tribes can talk to each other in Pidgin and fight each other less because they can finally understand each other. This is how a form of Pidgin finally became an official language in the country of Papua New Guinea, in West African countries, and in many places around the world. I love this language because you don't need crazy grammar, crazy long words, and crazy sentence structures just to talk to humans. All we really need is a way to understand each other, and this language has finally made it possible.
So, good day to our viewers from the local and from the international community. But before I proceed to the main topic that I will be discussing for today, first I would like to emphasize what is the relevance and what is the significance of the video that we have presented earlier. So the video that Nas Daily is talking about the importance of the English language. So it only tells us that it is very significant and it is very vital for the world to have one language that will connect the differences and the variety of cultures and nationalities that we have in the world. Because as we all know that we have so many nationalities, we have so many languages, and we have so many cultures, it is now very hard for us to communicate with the others. But we all know that we need to communicate with them. That is why we need to have that one language. And that one language, of course, is no other than the dominant language in the world, which is English. So that is the significance of the video that we have presented earlier. But now, I will be discussing about the final reflections in globalization and world Englishes. Now, before I go to the final reflection, first I would like to emphasize the three perspectives we have in globalization. The first perspective that we have is the pro-globalization perspective. So what is with the pro-globalization perspective? So first, because it is pro-globalization, it approves how does the globalization is taking place in the global arena. First, because of the capitalist agenda. It is very basic that they are pro-globalization because they believe that capitalism is working well with the globalization. Because of course, with the use of globalization, the businesses of those who are in the capitalism world will transcend from borders to borders. It means you can have your capitalism works from this country to other country and to another country, because that is what we meant by globalization. Aside from that, globalization will bridge the gaps that we have in the world, because we have varieties of languages, cultures, and nationalities. Globalization is trying to unify the diversified world that we have. Now, if we have the pro-globalization perspective, of course, we have the opposite one, and that is the anti-globalization perspective. Now, why we have that anti-globalization perspective, and what are their stance against globalization? Because first, the anti-globalization perspective believes that globalization is threat to local and indigenous languages. Because in globalization, they consider that the English language is far superior and the most important language that we have that will transcend across border. Now, they are trying to neglect or to disregard their local languages. So for example, just like here in the Philippines, we consider the English language as far superior than our own language, which is Filipino. Because we know different events for it to be formal, graduation day or any event, and even our legislation, it has to be English for it to be formal. But in fact, we have our own language. So does it mean that the Filipino language is less formal than the English language? So that is one of the points of the anti-globalization perspective. And aside from that, the anti-globalization perspective believes that it has a neo-colonial agenda. So when we say neo-colonial agenda, it means it is an indirect colonization. You are trying to colonize the country by instilling the imperialist culture, the imperialist products, and the imperialist ideas. For example, the Hollywood films, the products that are imported. As far as we know, the Philippines is fond of using imported products. They believe, or we consider as Filipinos, that the imported products are far superior than the local products. But in fact, by considering that, we are trying to kill our local cultures and the local products that we have. That is why anti-globalization perspective also considers that globalization is killing the locality. And the last perspective for globalization is the progressive globalization perspective. So in progressive globalization perspective, it tries to consider that all countries that wants to join in the global arena has their own choices. It means they have choices to be exercised and how they are going to adapt that globalization. Now, if we have the choices or we are independent in choosing our global path in the global arena, it only means that globalization is not trying to instill that it is killing the choices of each country. Because in fact, globalization is giving us more choices on how are we going to adapt in the global changes. So that is how the progressive globalization perspective is trying to tell us. Now, with the rise of postmodernism, the distinction between the concentric circles is now seen as blurring, as merging. So meaning, because of how the globalization works, we can no longer identify which countries are belong to the expanding circle and which countries are belong to the outer circle. So it only means that the globalization is trying to merge the distinction between those circles, because as far as we know, regardless of what nationality or what country you are belong to, there is really the need for us to connect with the world. Because of course there are things that our country that cannot provide, and we need to communicate with the other countries, and globalization is the only way for us to connect with the others. So that is why there is really a blurring boundary now between the outer and the expanding circle. Localization of Englishes now is seen in terms of the English taking on the local forms in different socio-political cultural contexts. Because how the countries use English is depending on the context and depending on the needs of the people. I would like to have an analogy. For example, McDonald's. The McDonald's is now taking the global arena. There are so many McDonald's franchises and branches all over the world. But although that McDonald's originates from the United States of America or from America, still other countries have their own versions of McDonald's. Because for example, in America, they don't have rice because rice is not their staple food. But because here in the Philippines, rice is a staple food, McDonald's now have rice here in the Philippines. So as you can see, different countries are trying to contextualize their adaptation with the globalization. Although that McDonald's originates from the America, but because we are adapting it as Filipinos, we are trying now to localize our version of McDonald's. Just like also the English language. Although the English language originates from those native speakers, but because we are Filipinos, we have our unique needs, we have our own context, we are now adapting the English language depending on our own context as Filipinos. Next, different schools of thought put different emphasis on the global and local forces which underpin the changes observed in the language domain. Because it only means that aside from the fact that the global factor is influencing how the locality is working, also the locality is contributing on how the global is working. So it means it is a bidirectional relationship. So it only means that the world Englishes and the globalization is interdependent to each other because they are contributing factors to both of them. And the boundary between what is local and what is global is increasingly seen as blurred. Because of their bidirectional relationship, of course, we cannot really identify which has that greater factor in influencing. Is it the global arena or is it the local arena? Because in fact, both are very vital in making the global process working. Now, aside from that, we would like to emphasize the social-linguistic of periphery. So, this SP took a critical perspective in describing the unequal relationships between the majority and the minority indigenous languages of Europe starting around 1970s. Now, the main agenda of that SP is to problematize the fishman's notion of diglossia. Now, because of globalization, there is now what we call the high language and the low language, which is the term that is coined from diglossia. So, though the problem with that, we are now trying to create superiority and inferiority among languages. Now, because of the need of globalization, we consider now those languages that are vital for globalization is far superior than the local languages. For example, just like my example earlier in the Philippines, we now consider the English language as superior and our own language, which is the Filipino, as inferior. Because as far as we observe during formal occasions, or even in our legislation, even in speeches, it has to be in the English language for it to be considered as formal. But every time we are talking in casual forms, for example, we talk to our friends, we need to talk in Filipino. But if we are going to present our thesis, for example, or we are presenting in a forum, it needs to be English. So as we can see, there is a distinction between the global language and the local language. So we are not trying to kill the local language that we have, especially here in the Philippines, because we now see the global languages as superior than our own languages. And aside from that, the concept of space is also important in shaping the way how the human experience interact with the world. Because of course, it has to be the space, because that space is where the process taking place. Now, what are those spaces? In the context of globalization theories, according to Murray, 2006, he describes the three views of spaces, such as the absolute, the relative, and the metaphorical. Now, I would like to emphasize the two. The first one is the absolute. When we say absolute space, it refers to the territoriality. So meaning, it refers to the nations, territories, and villages. Because there is actual distinction of that space. So I am referring to the spaces between the, for example, nations, regions. So those are the absolute spaces. The next space is the relative space. When we say relative space, it refers to the territoriality. Now, it is opposite to the first kind of space because that space flows electronically. For example, the World Wide Web, the networks, the social medias. So it is now space that do not consider the boundaries. Because the contemporary world now is best defined as a period of significant social, political, and cultural transformations. So that is why globalization now we're able to transcend across boundaries. That is why we have moved from what Krang in 1999 has described as world as mosaic, to world as a system, and currently to world now as a network. Why is that? Because we are now substantially detached from the territorial space. It only means that regardless of our territorial boundaries, we were able to communicate with the other countries and with the other cultures by the use of advanced technologies. Next, we operate now largely without the regards of the territorial distance. And of course, we now substantially bypass the territorial borders. So that is how the globalization works now. Now the biggest question is that, is globalization leading to homogenization or heterogenization? Well, actually for us, we believe that globalization is leading actually not just the homogenization but heterogenization also. So it means it leads to both of them. Because first, globalization, homogenization, because it unifies the diverse world that we have, and heterogenized because we were able to localize how we adapt globalization in our locality. Now, we would like to contextualize our reflection here in the Philippines. So first, I would like to emphasize that during these times, we are all aware that the Chegg Memo 20 was able to remove the Filipino subjects in the tertiary level. And that is very vital, or that is very responsive or very relevant to us Filipinos. Because the need for globalization, we are now trying to disregard our Filipino identity. Because one of the reasons of the Commission on Higher Education why they removed the mandatory Filipino subjects in the tertiary level is that they would like to emphasize that it is not just the Filipino language that we need to emphasize, but also the languages that will make us Filipinos as globally competitive. So now, the biggest question is that, is globalization trying to kill our identity as Filipinos? But in our group, we hope that as we try to adapt in globalization, we must not forget who we are as Filipinos. It is okay for us to learn the English language and be globally competitive. But we make sure that as Filipinos also, we don't forget our own culture and our own language that tells us who are we as Filipinos. Now, next, aside from that, globalization in English is also very important in exchange students and faculties. Because as we all know, the Philippine education system is also now having exchange students and exchange faculties. With that, we were able to open ourselves with how rich the global culture is. Because, you know, as you are being exposed to other cultures, we were able to observe how different their culture is to our culture, and by that, we will be drawing conclusions that is very vital to make our existence meaningful. And of course, with the use of globalization and world Englishes, in international forums, it is very important for us also to consider the English language. Because here in the College of Education, researching fuels our profession. And what is the purpose of having these researchers? It is of course for us to present and for the world to know what is our research all about. And that research cannot be presented with the other countries without having the language that will connect us to them, and that is the English language. And of course, globalization is also very important for us to understand how the global arena is taking place. And aside from that, the globalization in world Englishes is also very important in bilateral agreements of different countries. For example, the Philippines. So the Philippines cannot have an agreement with the Russian government, with the Chinese government, with the Japanese government that will help us in our problems and projects here in the Philippines without communicating to them. And for us to communicate with them, the Filipino language is not really effective because the Russian language, the Japanese language, and the Chinese language is far different from our language. But that one language that will make us connected to them is the English language. So that is why English language is very important in making the connection among countries very effective. And as we connect with the other countries, we were able to get help from them, and also as Filipinos, we're able to help them in the process. And now, as we reflect about that world Englishness and globalization, it only tries to tell us that the moment we understand that the English language here in the Philippines is being contextualized who we are as Filipinos, we no longer judge those people who have their own way or own use of the English language, because we have our own version of the English language. Just like how McDonald's, it doesn't mean that our McDonald's here in the Philippines is different from the McDonald's of the United States of America. It makes us less as Filipinos. It only tells us that we have our own identity. And as we try to accept globalization and the changes of the world arena, we make sure that we preserve our culture and our identities as Filipinos. So meaning if we have this kind of English language, it's fine because that is part of us being Filipinos. But more than being fine of having this kind of language is that we understand the contextuality and how rich the language we have. Because to conclude the reflections on globalization and world Englishes, we as humans and we as Filipinos, we must open our arms always to changes. But we must not let go our values as Filipinos and as human beings. And that's all. Thank you.